Well, first of all, I've been interested in color and color theory and colors generally for a long time. I don't know what you feel, but I feel often, these days there's not that much of a discussion about color, and this was something that was very much at the heart of conversations with Corb and the whole modernist discourse and things like this. But this is not where this particular book um, comes from or has a connection to. I mean, yes, uh, in a distant way. More immediately, I became interested in this because years and years ago, Peter Merkley and I worked together, and I also did a series of books about Swiss architects, and one of them was about Peter, the book called Approximations. And during that time that we spent together, through Peter, I learned about the German Jewish philosopher called I'm an art historian really, but also there is a kind of philosophical discourse to what he was doing, called Max Raphael, who had done he did a lot of writings. Many of the things were in German only, including a short text that he had published or was published, in fact, after he died, on the color black. And then I had this translated a while ago and had planned to write something, and ended up thinking about the relationship between art and architecture through the lens of the color black, but also in some ways as a kind of parallel to this work of Max Raphael. So the book that has just been published includes kind of long essay by me and a long essay, which was a book. So this was a book format, a kind of small book. So it's like putting two small books together. Um, and I use Max Raphael as a kind of reference because he speaks about a collection of paintings that were in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He was someone who'd left Europe, and was in New York in the 40s and sadly committed suicide in the early 1950s. So while he was in New York, he didn't have too many opportunities for work and things like this. And one of the things that he did was to spend a lot of time going around the museum, writing about a collection of paintings from the 16th, 17th, 18th century that used the color black as part of the painting. And then, of course, he was sort of in New York about the same time as the evolution of abstract expressionism and the emphasis on black by many of the painters. And so there's a kind of history that relates to an older tradition, and at the same time, while he's doing that, there are people who are beginning to participate in making completely black paintings. So I found that interesting, and I use that as a kind of springboard
as a start, yeah,
start a narrative about the connection between art and architecture.
And then when it comes to architecture, what I mean, I'm like when I saw color black, I guess my first instinct was to think of Mies, maybe. I don't know why. I don't know if you actually mentioned Mies at all. But then, of course, when this came up, and Peter Markley as well is like a kind of really clear reference point. But I just wonder then architecturally, how do you translate this interest?
Yes, I think those are some of the references, but there's also reference to the kind of depth of color, darkness, blackness, black, in Adolf Loos, in many other architects, in the way in which this tradition in some way persists in the work of individual architects who are working with the color black. I mean, more recently, this has become a more fashionable thing
Mhm.
in terms of the reference to black. But I think these people who were doing that, they were really focusing on on the status of this darkness, of this shadow, of this of the black. But I also started by the fact that you know, we've seen a lot about whiteness and about the international style and white architecture and whiteness as something which is the eye of truth and the association of that with modernity. And I felt that you know, writing about the the black is a kind of is another dimension of discussing color, but also something which is different than white and whiteness. Um, but there is another interesting aspect to this because Max Raphael was a very much a sort of Marxist um, art historian and wrote from a what you might call a materialist perspective. He wasn't contextualizing things, and so the question of description, the manner of description, all of these things matter. And you probably know I've been very interested in the relationship between writing and doing or writing and architectural imagination. And so in some ways, my writing about architecture and about contemporary architecture has something to do with the equivalence of what Max Raphael was doing, standing in front of these paintings and literally describing what the painting is doing. So I think so I think there's one aspect which is the history, the kind of discovering the moments in which black is actually part of architectural practice and thinking. But there is the other side of it, which is to do with um, the nature or the character of description, the method of writing as well. And then I think there is the fact that some of these themes have obviously been addressed in art history in a way that in architectural history we haven't had the same kind of attention. So I think the text or the book is also by working on this equivalence between art and architecture is also a way of bringing attention to certain forms of discourse or so that's another side of that. And then lastly, obviously today the color black is very much something that's also associated at times with questions of identity and there's a dimension of that which has been quite important for a certain number of artists, in particular African American artists, and some of them either come from architecture or they start from art and do architectural things, buildings, like the Städelschule Gate. So the book also has a conversation with Peter Markley, very architectural, and then with the Städelschule Gates, which brings this aspect of the connection to art, but also the intersection between art and architecture. And then the role of color at that point then exceeds the parameters of just being about color or non-color, but also, deals with the questions of blackness as color, but also blackness in terms of a certain heritage and tradition.
But it's amazing that color as a discourse has this. It's so tied to identity somehow. You know, in describing people of the heritage of peoples, but also in terms of like cultures are colorful culture. There's something about, you know, the clothing and the color of buildings that are also very kind of very connected to the identity. And, you know, postmodernism always being seen as this kind of very colorful, exuberant.
So, I mean, I think that inevitably that you go through certain periods, but this is not a book which is, in a way, a critique of postmodernism or blackness versus colorfulness or something like that. It's really focusing on the color black and the implications and how it's used in different contexts by different, you know, whether it's artists or the main focus for me is on architecture. But as a book, of course, there's also the relationship between architecture and art. But then the text of Max Raphael is purely about paintings, and so there you get into a lot of relational descriptions and conversations, because especially when you deal with paintings and invariably you're dealing with figures and clothing and things like that, or the relationship between foreground and background, many of the things that are also there in architecture. You know, this building, what's the setting, what is it in relation to, things like that. But Max Raphael is describing very precisely the line of the clothing and where red hits white and where is the black appearing and how are they juxtaposing you know, with each other. And I think all of those things demand a level of precision, you know, which I think the equivalence of that in terms of architectural discourse, for example, is something that is that's worthwhile. But, you know, something that doesn't happen during that period, or a discussion of figurative paintings, and where when you deal with, let's say, abstract expressionism or the role of black in the you know, the paintings of Ad Reinhardt or people like that, there is so much about the subtlety of the nuance of different tonalities of blackness, and whether it's dark brown or very dark blue, or which you cannot see in a photograph. And sometimes it's interesting how to obtain, you know, photographs that catch or capture something of this hue of the different tones of color, which also touches on the question of of affectual experience of things. It becomes more about the nature of experience in some way. So it's not just the discussion of the relationship, but really the way in which the relationships between different tones are about affects rather than, let's say, the image. So it touches on perceptual issues of experience, which is also relevant, since much of, you know, or a lot of discussions, you mentioned postmodernism, a lot of it has to do with the idea of the outline, of the way in which there is a distinction between something and something else through the outline, which then establishes the status of the image. So here, there is an image, but the image is also about the experience of the painting as you stand in front of it, and the way in which you experience these different colorations, these different tonalities, even though at first glance it appears to be all the same, but it isn't. And I think this has also interesting architectural consequences, which I've sort of written about, and some of the things that I've done in the past, either alone or with colleagues and things like that, are interested in a way in these affects. as much as anything else.
So I really enjoy this kind of jumping between different, almost like areas of discourse. So what you're describing now almost feels like a phenomenological sensibility. And then previously you were very much describing it as a kind of aesthetic, like it sits with this, in this realm of aesthetic theory. And then previously you also mentioned something which I thought was maybe really interesting and I'd like to explore a bit more, which is this relationship to, let's say in this case, in the case that you mentioned, like literary theory, or in some way, this point that you're making about a discourse that exists within some other field. Sorry, I'm saying literary theory, but it's really a discourse that exists within some other field that we almost haven't yet explored.
Yes. I think I understand what you mean. I'm not looking for let's say a body of discourse that exists in one field that can be transplanted into another field. I think I am very interested in the idea of things that may be happening in parallel, and the manifestations of this thing that's here over here is different. It's not the same, but it raises a certain mode of questioning, which for the other thing has a relevance because it produces certain modes of thinking, certain ways of considering, articulating. It's a disruption. It's a pause. It's a reflection. So I'm not looking for ready-made theories. I'm not trying to give an image to deconstruction, this kind of thing that has been very much prevalent. But it is that if you talk about the question of, because in architecture, we often, and I'm very interested in this, we talk about precedent. What's the precedent for something? That means, what is the point of reference? Where is it coming from? But also, what is the logic of this? Now, the way that we use the word precedent, let's say, for example, has certain similarities or parallels with the legal system of let's say, cases in law which have established certain precedent, and that precedent then becomes a form of implementation, from which a lot of the time no further deviation can be made because it has been established. Now, in architecture, the concept of precedent is not quite like that. It doesn't quite work like that. But still, the relationship between a thing now and something else, which is the reference point of this, and what are the procedures of translation, transformation, deviation from that original precedent, from the reference point, all of that. What do you do? How does it manifest itself? How do you think about it? I think that the procedure of investigation I find interesting. Let's say when you talk about poetry or poetic imagination, the idea of how you are constructing forms of imaginary discourse through poesis. Now, in architecture, you also have to create something, imagine something. But for example, in architecture, if you start talking about doing something which is poetic, it's already, makes me feel very uncomfortable, because it's already been translated into a certain body of work that invariably looks cute or something of that sort, that people think because it looks like that, then it is poetic. So I am I think it's important to be clear about the way in which you work with reference or with translation or transposition. I mean, all these things. Sometimes I use these as methods in a way, even in the context of the studio, which might come from, traditions of montage or something like this. But it's not intended to produce things that look like that. But it's more about a way of undoing, a way of unfolding, which then creates a certain level of rationality, objectivity, all of those as part of the process. So I don't want to produce something that can be excused because it's poetic, for example.
Well, maybe
I don't
the
know if
question,
it makes sense.
well, maybe the question is I mean, maybe the question could be also about what the conversation is. Maybe maybe it's actually a dialogue between that past thing and this thing that's here being created. So I like to, in a way, I like to think about it as a conversation, maybe. And I don't know if that's maybe an interesting way to think about.
Sure, I think the conversation is a good word in that it does mean, at least it implies certain kind of back and forth, or there is a sort of, it's not a one-way street. So it's a conversation, it's a dialogue, I think all these things. But I think it shifts the emphasis from the idea of the replication of an image towards certain modes of experimentation, investigation, forms of questioning, which then presumably is seeking some idea of new possibilities, being speculative. So it's the opposite, in a way, of taking something and producing something that looks like what you started with, or having the reference as something that's direct, but really the idea that we actually want to still make some form of contribution to
Innovative work.
to discovery and things like that, and especially when you are working within the context of the academy, and half of these things relate to pedagogy. You are also trying to think about ways in which the discourse about the project is something that is constantly evolving. It's not like you obviously need to have some level of familiarity, repetition, body of work that you are building on, but at the same time, you want to be doing something different rather than repeating. So these things apply, for example, to poetry as well, or to the discourse about writing. If somebody wrote a novel and all their novels were the same, but you recognize their style, their method, the mode of writing, but it's a different story, and it's a different world that they are describing. I think this kind of thing is interesting. Whereas if you think about, I don't know, a certain body, Richard Meyer, one of the things that becomes very important is the recognizability of the white building with its formal connections to the international style. That this is not the international style, but its recognizability is part of its brand identity. The same way that eating certain kind of food, or coffee or whatever, also has its brand thing. So I think that we're not quite in that space of trying to create forms of identity that are immediately to do with its brand. At the same time, architecture is constantly looking for a level of recognizability and that's part of the strength of certain things. So that's also a kind of conundrum between visual recognition and spatial and social exploration. And
But I guess still, and it's something I've written now recently for this project, and it's going to be part of the film that I'm making. But I make a point there that the importance of surprise.
Mhm.
And I say that all good buildings fail to meet our expectations, in a
Right.
sense that there's always an element of a surprise, really, that kind of holds the project.
Yes, yes, and that's what I mean also by disruption, discontinuity, deviation from like repeating the same thing as a style. Yes.
And Mohsen, when we talk a little bit about, I think it's interesting that you've, and it is talking about education, this is the place where, I mean, we learn by looking at buildings, by looking at architecture, and inevitably references are an important part of education. But I think that I just wonder how you think about it, having directed two schools, and is it important to still leave space for maybe ways of thinking which are not precedent oriented, which are not, let's say, reference rooted, to allow methodologies which are maybe a little bit more, I guess, phenomenological? And I guess, how do you do that?
Yes.
I mean,
So
I am thinking of Diploma 3, for example, Pascal Schoening, for instance.
yes. So I like your reference to two schools. And in some ways, I wish it had been two schools, but no. I've been in three schools because I've been at the AA, I've been at Cornell, and I've been at Harvard. So those are the.
But did you direct Cornell?
Yes, I was the dean at Cornell.
Okay. Apologies.
No. I was there for a short time. I was there for 3 years, uh,
Okay.
before coming back to the GST. Yes, I think that schools have to be very open today, and that you have to explore, um, you know, a pluralistic array of different kind of possibilities and options and things like that. I think the question for me is not so, maybe not so important where you start, but where you finish. And I think that that the idea of the discussion now that we're having about reference or precedent. I mean, now I teach an option studio. I don't really start with precedents. And I might start with certain texts or certain interventions that are so fast that they are not intended or they to be referential. And it has to do with the quickness of like proposing things because it asks for some things that are part of the more immediate response, let's say, of the student and things like that. But the fact is that that the discussion of typology, precedent, influence, origin, these are also part of the discourse of what we do. So on one level, as a theory person, as well as a kind of design or practice person, I think those are also interesting and valuable to engage with them in a way intellectually and also in terms of design. But let's say somebody starts with film, and whether through certain techniques of editing and working through films and things like that, they can discover some forms of spatial construction, but also configuration, things like this, through film, and they can articulate it. That's a very exciting thing. So because I work a lot in Japan, you could say it's a reference, but at the same time, let's say a film director like Yasujiro Ozu worked very directly with interiors and the position of the camera on the floor, to do with the sitting position of people on a tatami mat, and the camera at eye level on the floor, and then the interrelationship between spaces and forms of interior. So you could say that in the movies of Yasujiro Ozu, we discover more about interiority than many contemporary pieces of architecture, put together, because there's a level of sophistication, and that's to do partly with the cinematographer, but really the way in which the doorway and the frame and the space that's between rooms, but between the house and outside and all these things, they're describing, defining, drawing spatial situations, which in architecture school, people talk about perspective drawing, or, do a view of the interior, but you could say that certain cinematographers and certain directors have explored, especially the connection to interiors, but also exteriors, from which architects and designers can learn an enormous amount, right? At the same time, this is why I mentioned the fact doesn't matter where you start, but it's how you finish. I think that sometimes, let's say, a studio that also is dealing with film can end up trying to make a film, and the discussion of architecture is not so present. And I think that I still believe in the importance of disciplinary conversations and disciplinary discourse. So I think because you are in architecture school and you spend 1 term or 2 terms, 1 year making, taking things from other people's films doesn't make you a filmmaker. The same way that, doing a similar thing in the architecture unit doesn't make you completely a fully fledged architect. But I do think that what's interesting is this kind of tension between the visualization, the cinematography, the depiction of spaces, and let's or conditions. And because also people are speaking, because you have, let's say in films, the relationship between the body and the space, which is very difficult when people are doing, let's say, precedent, and they're only dealing with form, and there's no people. So
another important thing in film is that you also have time element.
Yes, you have the temporal dimension. So just to say that really the discussion of method or methods and their possible spatial or architectural consequences are very interesting, and we should encourage that, in the context of the academy. So I'm all for it, and I'm also for it to be articulating in some way a multiplicity of discourses in relation to the spatial.
But it seems like you put less emphasis on the method than onto the outcome, because you say it doesn't matter where. Well, you say it's more important where we end up as to where we've started. So
no, in fact, the method is very important. So I'm only saying that because a few moments ago, you seemed to suggest that we were now talking all about precedent, and therefore the idea of origin is
Mhm.
important. And I was trying to
Okay.
rebut your assignation or your like sticking the label of the origin or the source is important. And I was saying, no, actually, it's how you are going through that process. What is the method through which you start, and then where do you want to take this? So there's an anticipation of what you want to get out of it, and then you are following certain ways to to get to that. But it's also true that you're doing this in order to surprise yourself, to discover, to come across something that you haven't done before. And so, but I'm sure this conversation is going to sound very abstract to
Many
to
people.
very many people who listen to it, because I think when it comes to it, what is done in the school and what's done in the units and things like that are much more straightforward, because people are living 2 months, 3 months, 4 months figuring something out. So we are now just in a way summarizing or trying to theorize something which has a very long duration, and it's at each stage is much more clear, specific, pragmatic, whatever. Because if you're making a film, what is it about? What are you trying to do? What are the films? What did they do? All of those things. They have other. They have. There's a lot of decisions that are being made in order to select material and to recompose material and things like that.
Just on that, I actually agree with you completely that this obsession with the where things originate from, it's actually a very Nietzschean thing. Nietzsche always talks about how we're only comfortable with things that we know where they come from. I think there is something like that in somewhere in Nietzsche. Yes, maybe there is a kind of obsession, or we are more comfortable when we see where things originate from, yet innovation is something that is maybe like more future looking. So I guess maybe I could ask you about the role of, or the importance of innovation. Do you think that maybe in a kind of contemporary either society or architectural education, do we not put enough emphasis on innovation?
Um, I think that that's a hard question in a way to answer, partly because I think that before you mentioned my being in different schools, and one of the things that's interesting when you move from one kind of environment to another environment, which I'm sure you have from your own experience, it doesn't have to be between Europe and America and Asia and things like that. It can also be between one school and another. You realize that each school has a very specific culture, and it's very hard to define that, but it's really to do with what's happening there now, what happened there 5 years ago, where is it going, and these define in a way the characteristics of a specific milieu, of a specific environment within which you work. So if you're in teaching, let's say we talked before, you're teaching at Oxford Brookes and you're teaching in London at the AA, these two schools are different. Their characters are different. The student body, some of them might be the same people, but now that they're in these different schools, they're part of a different ambience or environment. And the same thing between the, let's say, the structure of the AA versus the structure of an American university, where there is tenure and there are faculty who have continuity, and that their relationship to their work is different than a place that is in a way more fragile. That's maybe the best way of describing it. So this is to say that you cannot teach the same thing in this place and then in that place, because the nature of response to what you want to do, what you have to say, what your position is, and things like that, is also going to be very much contingent on the milieu, the environment that is receiving this. Yes. So the question of what is different, innovative, speculative, experimental, I don't think that the word innovative is the only word. There are lots of these other words that speak about the possibility of producing forms of difference, and I think that needs to be tuned, that needs to be figured out in relation to specific conditions, because you go to one school and you see what's around, and in order for you to produce something really, Marko is doing something very interesting, which builds on the capacities that are there, but now it has a different outcome than what is there. You take that same thing to your other school where you came from, and it may not be seen as anything terribly speculative or experimental or innovative or something. So I think that this is very we should work on projects that add new forms of knowledge, that expand the field and the discipline, that contribute to societal transformation. I mean, these are all our grand objectives. But I also want to say that that defining our specific projects is highly contingent on the circumstances that we have. So let's say at a certain point, you can also say that the idea of what is avant-garde shifts, but institutions often, because it's contingent on their faculty who are there, sometimes the conception of the avant-garde remains the same, for a long period. So, who's to say what's avant-garde? But what was avant-garde 20 years ago might no longer be as avant-garde as the practitioners think they are.
It certainly isn't avant-garde, because I guess if it sits in the past, it's
yes, like... but Marko, the thing is that institutions are also reliant on who's teaching there. So part of the conundrum of institutional building, of institution building, is the degree to which you are able to mediate between certain forms of continuity of people, like, units, people who are there teaching, full-time faculty in America, it's like tenured faculty, things like this, and the overall impact of the institution. So how do you fine-tune this so that it's not just about changing everybody? It's like in a football team where a manager comes and reorganizes the structure of play. So instead of playing with 4 in the back, plays with 3 in the back. I mean, I don't know enough about this, but it's an idea of organizing things in order for them to have an impact. So a team that was like weak in defense, suddenly there's another manager who comes and then is very strong in defense, but then they don't have anybody who can score goals. So, so we have that in schools as well. And I think that this is an interesting thing about the question of what is it, what's an institution as a form of collaboration between people to produce these kinds of speculations and innovations that you're talking about.
But also, surely, Mohsen, that you're also in terms of who you the discourse that you're creating in a school. Surely you're also responding to the world, right? You're looking at what's happening in the world, and you're trying in some way to, I guess, be relevant, to talk to bring discourse in your educational environment, which will reflect the world, because ultimately your students are gonna go and be in that world.
I think that's true, and that's what we definitely try to do. But you also have to recognize that sometimes in architecture, in the field of design, it's not always super productive for every single person to be doing something that is relevant to the world and it's, you know, socially conscious and productive. I try to do that because I work at the intersection of the very architectural and really the kind of larger scale societal issues through the lens of architecture, not through the lens of urban design or, you know, planning or something like that. But I can also totally appreciate it if there are others who work in a much, much more abstract fashion, and they don't start or they don't make any claims about social relevance. They really work on questions of method. It's like the piano and doing the exercises. And that I've worked with incredible faculty whose work has been unbelievably abstract or technical or computational, but they've also been amazingly rigorous. And I can see that many of the people who go through that, they have certain capacities for imagination, for production, for creating certain formal responses that when it comes to getting projects for this or that or whatever, they also have an amazing talent and creativity. So I think that I certainly always, as a dean or as a head of school, promoted the question of, you know, social, environmental, political relevance. But I also recognize that the discipline of architecture also has certain things in it that are not always rooted in their social relevance as a learning process at the beginning. So
well, I think that's so. I mean, that is almost like fundamentally in this profession, because it takes 5-10 years to build a building. You know, it takes 3 years to design it. It takes 5-10 years to build it. I mean, a large project. You know, even in that time frame, so much would have changed. So many governments and so many social political issues would have changed that there is something that transcends the kind of daily politics.
For sure, yes.
I wonder, Mohsen, how much, so you're talking about kind of impacting the culture of a place, talking about students and students learning, but how have you learned going from this one place to another to another? I guess, how have the places where you've been impacted you? I mean, of course, you were at the AA, you were younger at the AA than you were at Harvard, for instance. And so there's age, of course, like you would just learn by default through age. But I just wonder how does the institution also shape the person that is in turn shaping the institution?
Yes, enormously. I mean, I was a student at the AA. I learned from a lot of people. I was in London at a particular moment, which was, very interesting at the school at a moment when the culture of the people who were around was interesting.
Who are the people? Maybe could you mention a few names of that immediate environment that we might recognize?
Well, I think when I was a student, I think that there were a number of people in the diploma school whose units were very much to do with the English scene, but there were others. I studied with Dalibor Vesely, who was from Prague, and incredibly knowledgeable person, and somebody who was obviously very well versed in philosophy and also architectural history. And I think those two things, combination of philosophy and architectural history, was very important at that time. But also Rem and Ilya Zengelis, for a short period of time, Bernard Tschumi. This is that kind of moment in the diploma school. But when I was, in fact, in the intermediate school, I was in a unit that was at that time called the super unit or something of this sort, because it basically had more students and more teachers than any other. And Ilya Zengelis was there, Sue Rogers, they were together, but people like Alan Cajon, I think for a short period of time, Norman Foster, there were a couple of interesting professors, Aristidis Romanos, people from Greece. They were all part of this amalgam. Then at the same time, John Fraser was there, and this was the, first time people before computers. So we were kind of working with computers that didn't draw a straight line. At that time, the line was still a series of dash, 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 dash. So you couldn't, the thing couldn't draw a straight line. So, these are some of the people who were around at that time. Obviously, when I was for quite some time teaching, and I was I was teaching in the diploma school, I was teaching in the intermediate school for a while, then teaching in the diploma school. And the point was that I developed as a teacher, not as an administrator, right? So partly what I learned was the fact that I didn't really have any enthusiasm for administration, and I wasn't bad at it. But if it wasn't really connected to pedagogy, if it wasn't involved, if it wasn't to do with this whole idea of kind of rethinking the intellectual project of the institution, and I think just what you learn is how to manage that, because it's a kind of orchestra, and you're kind of conducting this operation. So I was very conscious of the relationship between what I had learned as a student, and then as a teacher, and then from a teacher as a head of school, and someone who is always thinking about where is the institution going and what kind of contribution can it make intellectually. And you learn how to be, part of it is how to be effective. And also part of it is how to deal with other people. So I mean, you're talking about the fact that I'm older. Yes, certainly I feel it. But part of being also older is that I probably, I I've learned maybe to deal with circumstances or to deal with people differently than when you're in your, I was head of the AA when I was in my 30s. So it's a long time ago. And you don't, it's, of course you make mistakes and you learn things. But I think that I probably my social relations, I've learned something about that. I've definitely the question um, of um, of somehow, um, let's say, the emphasis on um, on intellectual research, on being able to, be a productive faculty member. As I went from school to school, I spent more time on that because I was working with people who are full-time academics. Of course, we would have visitors and things like that. And then, before going to the AA to be the head of the AA, I was at Harvard. So I'd been at the AA. I came to America. I was the director of the master's program, then went to be the head of the AA, then went to Cornell, and then came back to Harvard. But I had been faculty at two of these schools before becoming the head of the school or becoming the dean. I'd never taught at Cornell, even though I taught when I was dean. So I think that you really learn from these different circumstances of somewhere that's more fragile, somewhere where people have been there for a long time, somewhere where it's much more international. And now, I've also learned how to be a faculty member again for the last 4 or 5 years, and to have my own research project and my own, writings and things like this. And in a way, I never had the same kind of opportunity when I was at the AA. I mean, I had very interesting opportunities in terms of teaching, but because of the fact that I was doing other things, and I'm only sort of, teaching 2 days a week or something like that, it was more fleeting, this experience. Now, at this point in life, being able to have long-term projects that I work on for 3 years or 4 years, and being able to write as well as do my studio and courses and things like that. That's also very pleasurable. I mean, I loved when I was younger and I did the thing, but at this point I couldn't do that. At that point, I enjoyed it. So this is also something that I've learned how to how to focus in a way on my own work and have zero desire for management or running anything or being the director of anything, which is also
Which you've done. Which you've done.
which I've done for a long time. But the interesting thing is that I really started as someone who was a teacher, and I think the exciting thing is that I've kind of ended up or returned to teaching in a very different way, but in a very pleasurable way. And that's kind of super exciting.
Mohsen, you said this thing, and because what you said just now, it was something that I wanted to ask as a kind of first question, and that is that I discovered you really by watching AA lectures online, where you've introduced speaker after speaker after speaker, and I think it's in that in that kind of generating discourse, inviting people, who do I invite, who should I invite, that I think there's something important in that. And, you know, I myself, I'm inviting people to talk to, and it's actually a big part of
you have your own mini school, your private school.
Well, it's almost like it's a practice in a way. It's a form of practice. So I just wonder the importance of knowing, and how do you know who is that person that we should talk about? What's that instinct? Is it responding to the world? Is it responding to the personal? Identifying areas of discourse that you're interested in. Your interest in Japan, for example, and things like that. Like, where does that come from, or how do you articulate an interest or a conversation or a series of conversations that we should be having?